We rely on modern medicine to save our lives every single day. Yet, the entire foundation of that vital science rests upon a ghost. Consider the staggering contradiction of the man we call the father of medicine. He is famous for an oath he probably never wrote, strictly forbidding surgeries that he actually performed, and managing to cure diseases using a scientific theory that was entirely, fundamentally incorrect. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Before we descend into the shadowed temple ruins of ancient Greece to uncover the true origins of this phantom healer, I urge you to like, share, and subscribe. Join us as we rip away the centuries of myth to reveal the flesh and blood of history's greatest enigmatic figures. The year is roughly 460 BC. We stand on the sun-baked Greek island of Kos, adrift in the Aegean Sea. This is the classical period, the golden era of Socrates, the precise moment the Parthenon is being built. It is the absolute height of Greek cultural power. But medicine in this era was not a science. It was a highly localized, intensely religious monopoly. And the boy who would become history's ultimate physician was not some renegade outsider rebelling against the system. He was the ultimate insider. Born into a mystical, hereditary cult of religious healers known as the Scopiads, he was groomed from birth to essentially inherit the keys to the temple. His parents were the absolute elite of this closed world. His father, Hippocrates, was a prominent priest-physician, and his mother, Praxitela, belonged to the local aristocracy. Their family, the Scopiads, claimed direct, literal descent from Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. In the ancient world, tracing your lineage to a deity wasn't just a point of pride or family trivia. It was their brand, the entire foundation of their socioeconomic power. To understand how radical his later theories were, you must first feel the suffocating mysticism of the world he was destined to rule. If you fell sick back then, you did not pop into an urgent care clinic. You went on a full-blown religious pilgrimage to a healing temple, an Asclepion. The process was entirely steeped in heavily ritualized mysticism. Patients underwent a purification process involving fasting, bathing in sacred springs, and offering animal sacrifices to the gods. But the core medical treatment was a terrifying practice called incubation. Imagine being feverish and desperately ill. You are led into the abaton, the holiest inner sanctum of the temple. You sleep there on the cold floor. The belief was that Asclepius himself, or his sacred animals, would visit you in a dream. Those animals were non-venomous snakes, freely slithering around the temple floor in the pitch dark. To them, this terror was divine intervention. In the morning, the patient would recount their dream to the Asclepius priests. The priests acted as translators, interpreting the dream and prescribing a cure based on that so-called divine message. It was pure magical thinking. Disease was viewed as a moral or spiritual mechanism. You angered an invisible force, broke a taboo, and the deity struck you down. The priests were merely mediators trying to lift the curse. For the priests, it was the perfect, totally risk-free business model. If the patient recovers, the god is merciful, and the priest's interpretation was genius. If the patient dies, they clearly just didn't have enough faith, or the god's wrath was too big to overcome. The healer is literally never at fault because the actual mechanism of healing is entirely out of their hands. So, what compels the son of a high priest, someone whose entire family wealth and status depends on maintaining this magical monopoly, to look at the snake pits and dream altars and decide to upend the whole system? It was a colossal risk. He didn't just tweak the temple rituals. He violently severed the tie between the divine and the physical body. He posited that the gods have absolutely zero interest in your cold or fever. He was heavily influenced by broader intellectual currents, studying pre-Socratic philosophers like Hippocrates, the man who first theorized that the universe is made of atoms. He also studied under rhetoricians like Gorgias. These philosophers were asking structural questions about the cosmos, looking for the natural laws governing storms or earthquakes. They were looking for physics, not theology. Hippocrates simply took that philosophical lens and turned it inward. He demanded to know the structural natural laws governing human flesh and blood. The defining battleground for this heresy was epilepsy, the sacred disease. Epilepsy absolutely terrified the Greeks. A perfectly healthy person suddenly falls to the ground, convulsing, foaming at the mouth, eyes rolled back. To an ancient observer, a severe epileptic seizure looked exactly like demonic possession. It looked like a god had violently taken control of the vessel. But then, his school of thought releases the treatise on the sacred disease. It is one of the most intellectually aggressive documents of antiquity, pulling absolutely no punches. The author violently mocks the magicians, purifiers, and temple charlatans who claim epilepsy is divine. He states clearly that it appears in no wise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause from which it originates. A massive mic drop for 400 BC. His internal biology was totally wrong, but his logic was sound. He argued it was a mechanical failure in the brain. He theorized that an excess of cold, wet phlegm from the brain rushed down into the blood vessels. When this cold phlegm hit the warm blood, it blocked the vital air, the pneuma, from circulating through the body. The blood, literally struggling to circulate against this wave of cold phlegm, was what caused the violent physical spasms. He replaced an angry, invisible god like Apollo with a fluid dynamics problem. The intellectual leap is breathtaking, and a plumbing problem is solvable by human hands. You cannot debate a god, but you can theoretically flush out a blocked pipe. This was a profound socioeconomic risk, telling the ancient Greeks that temple sacrifices wouldn't cure their epilepsy, risked not just his livelihood, but his actual life. The threat of being accused of aceivia, or impiety, was very real. Much like Socrates, who was executed just decades later for corrupting the youth and questioning the gods. He managed this transition brilliantly by democratizing medical knowledge. He opened the medical school at Kos to anyone who could pay the fee and swear a specific oath, breaking his own family's hereditary monopoly of the Asclepius. He offered the public something highly tangible that temple magic couldn't: predictability. He observed, recorded data, and provided prognosis. He could look at a family and tell them exactly what would happen to their sick relative over the next 7 days. That empirical comfort allowed his rational school to outcompete the terrifyingly unpredictable temples in the free market. Yet, stripped of magic, standing at the bedside of a dying patient, he had literally no modern tools. No stethoscopes, no thermometers, no lab tests. Even worse, to the Greeks, a dead body was a major source of spiritual pollution, miasma, so he was not legally or religiously allowed to dissect a human corpse. Fundamentally locked out of looking inside the very machine he was trying to fix, he built an entire medical system based exclusively on observing the exterior. Like a mechanic unable to open the car hood, he became an absolute master at listening to the engine hum, feeling the heat radiating off the metal, checking the exhaust. This constraint led to the most enduring and disastrous medical theory in human history: the four humors. For 2,000 years, this was the undisputed law of human biology. The humoral theory posited the body was a microcosm of the natural world, which was made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. The body was governed by 4 corresponding liquids. Blood was hot and moist like air. Phlegm was cold and moist like water. Yellow bile was hot and dry like fire. And black bile was cold and dry like earth. Health was a dynamic equilibrium of these fluids, eucrasia. Disease, or dyscrasia, was a mechanical imbalance. If a patient arrived in the middle of summer, flushed, sweating profusely, with a violent fever, the physician categorized them thermodynamically, excessively hot and wet, and they had an overabundance of blood. Summer was associated with heat and bile. The treatment protocol was basic arithmetic, artificially induced the exact opposite state. To cool the patient, he might prescribe a dietary regimen of barley water, cucumbers, or specific cooling herbs. But if the imbalance was severe, interventions became incredibly aggressive. To physically remove the hot, dry humor, they induced violent vomiting or diarrhea, using severe purgatives like hellebore. Or they would open a vein and perform bloodletting to physically drain the heat right out of the body. They had complex charts mapping which specific veins to open based on the season, the astrological alignment, and the specific organ they believed was congested. It was a perfectly logical thermodynamic equation applied to an entirely fictitious biology. This methodology, gathering data, forming a hypothesis, and attempting targeted intervention based on natural laws, was the actual birth of the scientific method in healthcare. His brilliance expanded outward in the treatise on airs, waters, and places. It reads like a 21st century textbook on public health and epidemiology. He instructed traveling physicians to immediately study a new city's exposure to the winds and the sun. He analyzed whether the local water supply was marshy and stagnant, or flowing from deep, cold rock springs. He evaluated if the inhabitants were heavy drinkers and eaters who avoided labor, or if they were industrious and lean. He essentially invented the concept of environmental determinism in health, theorizing that inhabitants relying on stagnant marsh water and facing hot south winds would naturally have moist, phlegmatic constitutions, making them prone to endemic diseases like chronic dysentery or certain types of winter fevers. Chronic illness wasn't just an individual, isolated failure. It was a product of the patient's ecosystem. Modern preventative medicine and public health are entirely predicated on that exact concept. Because the physician's own senses were the laboratory, physical examinations were shockingly intimate. They would literally smell a patient's sweat, looking for specific acidic or sweet odors. They closely examined the color and consistency of a patient's urine, and in some cases, they would actually taste the urine to check for sweetness, an early diagnostic marker for what we now know as diabetes. They would listen closely to the chest, actually shaking the patient by the shoulders to hear if fluid was sloshing around in the lungs, a procedure known as Hippocratic succussion. Through intense, unbroken observation, he documented what we now call Hippocratic fingers, digital clubbing, where the tips of the fingers bulge out and the nails curve over the top, almost looking like an upside-down spoon. He noted that when a patient presented with these misshapen fingers, they were almost always suffering from a severe chronic disease of the lungs, like empyema, where pus gathers in the pleural cavity. Modern medicine knows that digital clubbing is a sign of chronic hypoxia, a long-term lack of oxygen in the blood, usually caused by severe pulmonary or cardiac issues. He didn't know what oxygen was, nor what the heart actually did as a pump, but he connected the deformed fingernail to the decaying lung entirely through brute force observation. He also cataloged the facial signs of impending death, which is still known today as the facies Hippocratica, the death face. He described the sharp nose, the hollow eyes, the collapsed temples, the cold, drawn-in ears, and the taut, dry skin of the face. He wrote that if a doctor saw this specific presentation, and it wasn't just due to starvation or lack of sleep, it was an infallible prognostic sign that the patient would die within days. Accurately predicting the exact trajectory of a disease proved to the family that the physician understood the natural laws governing the illness, and it was a defensive tactic, pronouncing the case fatal legally, and socially protected himself from being blamed for the death. He was not an aloof philosopher in a white robe dispensing gentle dietary advice. He was up to his elbows in human bodily fluids and pain. The texts reveal highly detailed treatises on proctology, treating fistulae and hemorrhoids, incredibly common ailments in antiquity, given the diets and the amount of horseback riding without stirrups. He details how to treat severe prolapsed hemorrhoids using a red-hot cauterizing iron. He gives step-by-step instructions on how the patient should be positioned, how the assistant should physically hold them down, and how the physician should burn the hemorrhoids away, explicitly noting that the physician shouldn't hesitate or show fear, despite the patient screaming. The use of fire or cauterization was an absolute cornerstone of ancient surgery. It stopped bleeding instantly and practically eliminated the risk of infection by searing the tissue shut, which was critical in an era thousands of years before antibiotics. This pragmatic, ruthless approach birthed the famous Hippocratic aphorism, "What drugs will not cure, the knife will. What the knife will not cure, the cautery will. What the cautery will not cure must be considered incurable." But here is the massive historical curveball that upends everything we have just discussed. We have these incredible texts on epilepsy, on the humors, on epidemiology, on surgical cauterization. But what if I told you the historical man named Hippocrates likely didn't write a single word of them? This brings us to what scholars call the Hippocratic question. The overwhelming consensus, stretching from ancient commentators right up to modern philologists, is a resounding no. Hippocrates, the historical man, likely wrote almost none of the texts attributed to him. When linguists and historians analyze the massive 60 to 70 distinct treatises of the Hippocratic corpus side by side, it is immediately obvious that they are not the work of a solitary genius. The differences are not subtle shifts in tone. They are fundamental, violent clashes in philosophy, vocabulary, and target audience. Some treatises are highly technical, step-by-step manuals written specifically for practicing surgeons using complex anatomical jargon. Others are broad, sweeping philosophical speeches, written to be delivered to an audience of laymen in a public square. The medical theories aggressively contradict each other. You have one text arguing that diseases are caused by imbalances in 4 humors. You turn to another scroll in the exact same collection, and the author vehemently argues that there are only 2 humors, or that diseases are caused by air currents trapped in the blood, explicitly mocking the 4-humor theory as total nonsense. The most glaring contradictions stem from the inclusion of texts from a fiercely hated rival. The school of Kos, where Hippocrates taught, had a bitter rival on the peninsula of Cnidus. The Cnididians and the Coans were locked in a fundamental debate over how to categorize disease. The Cnididians focused on localized, specific symptoms. If a patient had a cough, a fever, and chest pain, they categorized that as 3 distinct localized diseases, making them the ancient precursors to modern medical specialists. The Coans, conversely, were holistic and prognostic. They believed the specific location of the pain was way less important than the patient's overall systemic imbalance. Yet somehow, foundational texts from both of these violently opposed schools ended up bound together under the single name Hippocrates. How did all these conflicting scrolls get lumped together? It comes down to the mechanics of ancient publishing. Most historians believe the Hippocratic corpus isn't a book. It is a bookshelf. It is likely the surviving remnants of an entire medical library. Enter the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. The Ptolemaic kings of Egypt were absolutely obsessed with collecting all the knowledge in the world. They spent vast fortunes buying Greek scrolls, going so far as to literally confiscate books off ships docked in the harbor, keep the originals, and give cheap copies back to the sailors. Because the Alexandrian librarians paid premium prices for authentic works of great masters, there was a massive financial incentive for book dealers to take anonymous scrolls, or those written by lesser-known doctors, and simply slap the label Hippocrates on them to get a higher price. Counterfeits. Once cataloged together in Alexandria, the distinct authorship was completely erased by the bureaucracy of the library. The corpus is a massive, crowdsourced document spanning hundreds of years, edited by dozens of practitioners with wildly different viewpoints. Instead of crediting the collective effort, history just decided to credit the server host. The most compelling piece of evidence regarding true authorship actually comes from Aristotle. Writing closer to the era of the historical Hippocrates, Aristotle explicitly discusses the treatise on the nature of the human being, the foundational text that formally established the 4 humors. Aristotle states that this text was written by Polybius, Hippocrates' son-in-law, the man who actually took over the school, the man who actually codified the theory that defined medicine for 2 millennia was Polybius. Yet his name evaporated, swallowed entirely by the gravity of his father-in-law's legendary branding. And the PR machine did not stop there. Centuries later, an entire genre of historical fan fiction sprang up around him, known as the pseudepigrapha. These were fake letters, forged speeches, and completely fabricated biographies designed to turn him into a morally infallible Greek superhero. There is the famous legend of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, whose army was supposedly struck by a devastating plague. The king sends envoys with literal mountains of gold to beg Hippocrates for a cure. And Hippocrates, standing tall, rejects the infinite wealth, declaring, "I will not treat the enemies of Greece." It is beautifully constructed patriotic propaganda, emphasizing that a true physician cannot be bought. But there is absolutely no historical evidence it ever happened. Then there is the legend that he saved the city of Athens from the catastrophic plague in 430 BC by deducing a corrupted miasma and ordering massive bonfires with aromatic herbs to purify the atmosphere. It sounds incredibly cinematic until you check the definitive historical account written by Thucydides, who actually lived in Athens, caught the plague, survived it, and exhaustively documented the nightmare. Thucydides never mentions massive bonfires, and he never even mentions the name Hippocrates. These legends were retroactively constructed to serve the agendas of later physicians, most notably Galen. Galen, a brilliant Roman physician living 600 years later, built a massive dogmatic medical empire and needed an untouchable ancient authority as his bedrock. He crowned Hippocrates as the flawless god of medicine, deciding which texts were genuine based entirely on whether they agreed with Galen's own worldview. But Hippocrates was undeniably a real, highly respected historical figure. Plato, his younger contemporary, mentions him by name in the Protagoras, comparing him to the greatest sculptors of the age. He was clearly a charismatic teacher and a master observer. But the violent cultural paradigm shift he represented, moving from divine magic to rational science, required a monolithic, heroic figurehead. He became the vessel for the ideal, which brings us to the ultimate document that bears his name. The Hippocratic Oath. The oath is a historical minefield, riddled with massive contradictions. Most historians place its composition in the late 4th century BC, meaning it was written after Hippocrates was already dead. Scholars argue it wasn't even written by mainstream Hippocratic doctors, but by a fringe, deeply mystical philosophical sect called the Pythagoreans. When you analyze the specific moral prohibitions in the ancient text, they align perfectly with strict Pythagorean dogma regarding the absolute sanctity of life and hierarchies of loyalty. The original text explicitly forbids surgery. It reads, "I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from stone, but will withdraw in favor of such men as are engaged in this work." It explicitly bans lithotomy, cutting into the bladder to remove kidney stones. How can the foundational ethical document of Hippocrates ban the exact surgical procedures, cauterizing hemorrhoids, setting fractures, drilling into human skulls, that made his doctors famous? Because it was clearly not a universal, state-mandated code of conduct. It was a highly specific, private guild contract for a localized fraternity of doctors. Lithotomy in antiquity was incredibly gruesome, involving cutting into the perineum without anesthesia. The mortality rate from hemorrhage and infection was massive. If a traveling physician botched it, it would absolutely destroy the reputation of the entire guild. They were swearing an oath to stay in their lane. It was an ancient liability waiver, designed for pure brand protection. This brand protection extended to enforcing strict in-group loyalty, swearing to treat the teacher as equal to parents, and sharing wealth, and to the fiercely debated prohibitions on euthanasia and abortion. The text explicitly forbids giving a lethal drug or a destructive pessary to cause abortion. In classical Greece and Rome, providing hemlock for physician-assisted suicide, as well as abortion, were legally and culturally widely practiced. Why ban them? On a purely pragmatic level, a guild of traveling healers needed to establish absolute trust. If you are inviting a stranger into your home to treat a sick patriarch, you need an ironclad guarantee that this physician hasn't been bribed by a rival family member to slip poison into the medicine. By publicly swearing a sacred oath to the gods, they carved out a niche of ultimate, unquestionable purity. The pledge of medical confidentiality served a similar diagnostic purpose. In a society with no privacy laws, a patient must feel safe enough to reveal deeply intimate, embarrassing, or legally compromising details so the doctor can observe the truth. When modern medical students graduate today, they rarely recite this original text. In 1964, Dr. Louis Lasagna completely gutted the ancient mechanics of the oath, creating a secular revision. He removed Apollo and Asclepius, entirely stripped out the ban on surgery, and removed specific prohibitions against abortion and euthanasia to align with modern legal frameworks. He shifted the focus to a nuanced philosophy of care, warmth, sympathy, and the beautiful admission, "I will not be ashamed to say I know not." If we have deleted every line of code from the original ancient document, are we just keeping the title for the aesthetic vibe of ancient authority? No. It is an act of moral memory. When a 24-year-old medical student, holding a tablet loaded with AI diagnostic tools, stands up and recites an oath tracing back 2,400 years to a dusty Aegean island, it forces them to pause. It reminds them that despite all the technology, the core dynamic remains exactly the same. A vulnerable, frightened human being is asking them for help. And yet, this sacred chain was almost broken. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the intellectual infrastructure of Western Europe collapsed into the Dark Ages. The rational approach to medicine engineered by the School of Cos was abandoned. Texts decayed, and Western Europe violently regressed back to the snake pits of supernatural healing and demonic possessions. The legacy of Hippocrates was hanging by a literal thread of decaying scrolls. It would have been completely lost to the ashes of history, if not for an unprecedented intellectual rescue mission launched by the Islamic Golden Age. Starting in the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate established the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad. Their staggering mandate: gather all the knowledge of the known world and translate it. Syriac Christians, like the brilliant Nestorian physician Hunayn ibn Ishaq, mastered Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, meticulously translating the Hippocratic corpus and inventing entirely new Arabic medical vocabulary to capture the nuances of the Greek humors. They did not just preserve the texts, they violently upgraded his theories. The Persian polymath al-Razi, Rhazes, practicing in the 9th and 10th centuries, used strict Hippocratic methods of continuous bedside observation to reliably differentiate between smallpox and measles, without ever understanding virology. He meticulously tracked the presentation of fevers and the exact location of back pain, and even dared to publicly criticize Galen in his blasphemous book, Doubts About Galen. The ultimate synthesis was achieved in the 11th century by Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who wrote the Canon of Medicine. Avicenna took the massive, chaotic, contradictory pile of the Hippocratic corpus and Galen's sprawling texts, cleaning up the mess and synthesizing them into one perfectly organized, logically cohesive system. He integrated hundreds of new pharmacological drugs from India and the Middle East. When translated into Latin in the 12th century, the Canon of Medicine flooded back into Europe, becoming the absolute standard medical textbook from the Renaissance right up to the 17th century. History is not a straight line, it is a massive relay race. The Greeks dropped the baton in the mud during the collapse of Rome. Islamic scholars picked it up, cleaned it off, ran with it for 500 years, heavily upgraded the materials, and eventually passed it back to the West. Hippocrates survived the darkness only because he was adopted and protected by the East. As for the mortal man, the son of the temple priests, lived a remarkably long life of constant travel and teaching, eventually settling in Thessaly and dying in the city of Larissa at an age debated to be between 83 and a staggering 109 years old. For over 2 millennia, the exact location of his grave was totally lost, swallowed by the earth. It remained hidden until 1826, when a massive, unseasonal flood caused the Peneus River to burst its banks. The violent waters washed away layers of topsoil, leaving a stone sarcophagus exposed right there in the mud. Archaeologists cleared the debris and read the ancient Greek inscription, Hippocrates, the man who dedicated his life to proving that nature, not the gods, was the ultimate force governing humanity, had his hidden tomb unearthed by the sheer, relentless natural force of a river flood. We have tracked a boy born into a magical snake cult who committed professional heresy to prove diseases are natural. He operated completely blind from the outside, utilizing a flawed theory of humors that somehow birthed the scientific method. He became a brand name, stamped onto a crowdsourced encyclopedia of conflicting scrolls, his name forever attached to an oath he didn't write, which banned the surgeries he actually performed. Does it actually matter if the historical man wrote a single word of his corpus? Perhaps his ultimate legacy was the invention of an ideal. The historical man was flawed, constrained by the taboos of his time, and his biology was profoundly wrong. But the myth of Hippocrates, the heroic, flawless father of medicine who binds himself to a sacred trust, has inspired millions of physicians to strive for greatness over 2,400 years. The myth might actually be more vital to the integrity of modern medicine than the man himself could ever have been. If you found this descent into the shadowed truth of medical history as fascinating as we did, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Leave a comment below. What shattered your perception the most? Was it the authorship mystery, the hidden truths of the oath, or the absolute rescue of Western medicine by the Islamic Golden Age? Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you in the next chapter of history's greatest secrets.